White text over video of past events. Logo, Cultural Access Collaborative. Professional Development Series presents. Director of Artistic Sign Language. How to dazzle your audience. At left, presentation slides. All content will be voiced. At right, stacked mini videos of English speaker and ASL speaker.
All right. Hello and welcome to our Director of Artistic Sign Language, or DASL, presented by the Cultural Access Collaboration. We are happy to have you here. My name is Josh Garrett. I'm a steering committee member with the collab. My pronouns are he, him. My visual description would be white bearded male with a headset on, gray backdrop, and black collared shirt. Accessibility is a priority for us here, so our program today does include live captioning provided by Efficiency Reporting Services, thank you to them, as well as ASL interpretation, which will be provided by Sheila, Jessica, and Ahmed. So if anyone here would like to view captions in a separate browser, you can also do that using a stream text link. We've included that in the chat. You can also scan the barcode, which will be on the next slide here.
QR code top center.
You can simply use the barcode with your phone, so you can view it on a phone or a device, or you can go to the chat, click there. You can also utilize captions within Zoom. Excellent. We do encourage you to submit questions for our presenters. You can do so using the chat function. So if you have any questions or issues regarding accessibility as well, please reach out to our support team. They will be there in the chat function as well. If the chat pop-ups are bothersome to you, you can turn those off. You would do so by doing the show chat previews by clicking the caret next to the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Excellent. Now, for those of you who are not already familiar with the Cultural Access Collab, our mission is to empower Illinois' cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. So there's 4 primary pillars central to our work, which we will talk about on the next slide here. The first being, next slide, please. The first being professional development. What you see on screen here is a screenshot of our website. In the top right corner, you'll see the 3 lines. If you were to click there, you can click on professional development. We'll take you to this page highlighting our professional development opportunities. That is one of our pillars. And next slide, please. Next, same website, clicking in the same location, it will take you to this web page that's called Equipment Loans. Under Equipment Loans, what you will see available will be audio description kits that will be available for checkout for free. We also have assistive listening systems that are able to be checked out and utilized in your cultural spaces. Do-it-yourself captioning equipment, as well as portable FM systems. So again, this is another resource available to you, one of our pillars, but a free resource available to you across the state. Currently, it's located in Chicago, but we do hope in the future to be able to offer this statewide. Next slide, please. Another pillar would be an access calendar. So this is for anyone who has access related activities. You can send those in. We can add these to the calendar, again, right on our website, top right-hand corner, click access calendar. It will take you there. And as you scroll down the page, you're going to see a list of upcoming items that provide access of different types. Next slide, please. Excellent. So right now we do have 4 presenters who will be participating with us today. I'm thrilled to have them. We have Crom, Tina, Susan, and I as well. We'll be sharing a bit each. So as each presenter begins to share, they're going to give you their bio, so you'll learn more about them at that point. We also have the full bios listed. So if you really want to read up everything about each of the presenters, you can currently scan this code, but also at the end, at some point after this workshop, we will be emailing you this information and you'll be able to have that information there too.
Presenter bios QR code at center. Link in video description below.
So first off, we are very pleased to announce Crom being here with us, part of the collab, also leading charge today. Crom, if you will please hop in and tell us a little about yourself, we would appreciate it.
Next slide. What is a Director of Artistic Sign Language? Crom signs while Ahmed interprets.
Hi, thank you so much, Josh, for that warm welcome. Yes, I am Crom Saunders, and my background relative to this is that I am a certified deaf interpreter, and I work a lot in theater as well. So I do interpreting work as well as director of artistic sign language DASL work. I am a white man, cleanly shaven head. I have big bushy eyebrows, and I'm wearing a dark blue button-up shirt. The background is probably like a blue-gray wall. So I'd like to talk about what a DASL incorporates and what that really means. And I want to talk about what that acronym is. It's a Director of Artistic Sign Language, often known as DASL. That profession is relatively new, but that practice has been in place for such a long time, and it's been called many other things, such as like a support role. But it's as the industry has begun to set up standards, they have now set up this position, the DASL, and it incorporates a lot. Oftentimes, it is a deaf person coming to work with actors or interpreters, really for anybody whose role incorporates ASL. It could be a part of the performance, it could be theater interpreting for the audience. And I'll go ahead and talk about some of these things that we see on the slide. For example, cultural mediation. When a DASL comes in, they also function as an advocate and they educate people on deaf culture. And they'll talk about what works in the show and what doesn't, especially if they have deaf characters in the show. So maybe some interactions just don't quite make sense culturally, and that those are some things that DASLs can provide advice on. So, for example, how to get the attention of a deaf person. There's also a bit of advocacy for the deaf actors as well. So DASLs can provide that advice and direct that advice so that they can improve the show as best as possible. So there's also that education component to it. And there's also overlap with some of these other ones. So advocacy and education do play into each other hand in hand. A big part of being a DASL is also dramaturgy. So that's typically talking about shows themselves and the context and history around those shows. So what so a lot of people don't really understand what dramaturgs do, but they know the history of the show and they also think about how ASL can be encompassed within that. So it's often not just ASL, there are also other sign languages that can play a part in these shows. So maybe if a character is speaking German, it would be appropriate to have German Sign Language instead of American Sign Language, just so the deaf people can have the same experience. I'm sure that most people would not understand German when it's being spoken on stage, so we'd like to provide that equal access to our deaf audience members so that they can experience that same thing of not understanding what's going on. So sometimes that is appropriate. There are also variants and dialects of ASL all across the US. So maybe that story is happening in Ohio as opposed to maybe NYC, maybe somewhere in California. You're going to see variants in sign languages. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a dialect either. It's similar to ASL, but it is also considered a separate language. There is Black American Sign Language. So it's considered the sign language equivalent of AAVE, and it's developed a bit differently than ASL is. So it's not considered a standard of ASL. It's not necessarily a mainstream language, but it has been set up for decades now, and it's been a part of American Sign Language history. There is also protactile, which is for deaf-blind people. It's based off of ASL, but it has since developed some of their own signs. And sometimes protactile is included in our work, and it's pretty common in DC to see that in shows. So we find out how that ties into the story, and then we also work as consultants. So we may do some of that translation work, whether it's done before then, or maybe if we translate the work completely, I can provide feedback on their translation work as well. And we also double check to make sure that the timing is correct and the sign choices are appropriate. So we can see clearly who is speaking and when. So if we're working with actors who are signing on stage, it's the same concept. I mean, it makes sense, right? You want to make sure it's in a context that works. If there's a signer and speaker going back and forth, you need to have that timing. You need to figure out how that will work. And it needs to look like a real life conversation. And it also needs to look natural. So that is what is so important about this work. A big part of this job is definitely consultation. And oftentimes when people think of a DASL, they think it's just somebody who provides feedback about sign choices. But there is a lot of prep work involved. There's the dramaturgy aspect. There's the knowledge of all sorts of varying signs. And for translation, it needs to make sense and it needs to be in line with the story and its foundation. After that, of course, there's room for creativity and some fun to be had. It's theater after all. So it's more appropriate for theater and it has its kind of, it's coming to life. They have a lot more of that creativity in there. There's also music as well, which, doesn't necessarily reflect real life here. But sometimes some of those aspects are a bit more surreal or a bit more poetic. And so we want to have the ASL reflect those components of that language. So I've done works for Shakespeare. He's famous for his wordplay. So we try to have sign play to match that. Then we take a look at that and see how we can still make sure that that signing is accessible. So the DASL will provide feedback on blocking, for example, which would be interpreter placement. Sometimes the interpreters may need to move to match what's happening on stage. So we also provide feedback on that. It's called blocking. And we also call interpreters on and off because sometimes there are scenes that interpreter may not be needed. Maybe it's only one person having a monologue. Maybe it's only two people. When it starts to get more and more, then you can vary between 1 to 3 interpreters. For actors on stage using sign language, it's a similar concept. It's to make sure that one of the responsibilities is to make sure that they're not blocking themselves or that their sign language is visible. And it has to be in line with the choreography as well. We don't want to make sure it looks artificial. We don't want it to look unnatural, that you're stepping to the side and signing. We want it to look like an actual conversation. We want it to look as natural as possible. So now you can see that we have some more, there are more steps to this work. And now you have an understanding of how people work together and how deaf culture and the research, all the background work that we do ties in to this work. I mean, there's translation and there's opportunity for creativity as well. We also have to figure out logistics. And ideally, all of this happens before the show. I mean, hopefully we have all the materials and anything we need to have an appropriate discussion and be prepared. But during the show, it's not always required, but it's a practice that I use. And I think it's an important responsibility for a dazzle and it's beneficial. However, it is more work, but during the show, I'm not able to communicate directly with the actors. I mean, they've already rehearsed that. They've already rehearsed their parts, but I can give them feedback after the show, after watching their work. So maybe I chat with them, maybe I talk to the director or the stage manager, the house manager. If I'm able to maybe have a conversation with the cast afterwards. That's some feedback that I can provide. However, with the interpreters as well, I can support them during the show. So as they're interpreting, I can feed them lines and feed them any information they may need. So maybe there are some more complex topics and maybe they haven't fully memorized it, or they may not be as confident. There it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe they just changed the day before and they haven't memorized that change yet. Some interpreters are not familiar with some of the language and they may miss their cues because it's not necessarily just easy translation work. In those instances, I am able to provide those cues. I can let them know, oh, who's coming up next, and that can prepare them to role shift into that character. So in that moment, we are working as a director for the interpreters. So we're feeding, we're supporting. Sometimes the interpreters may forget a cue for when they're supposed to get off and come sit down, and so I'll cue them for that. I'll tell them to come sit down. Sometimes the lighting may be for a specific area and the interpreter may have stepped out of the area. That's another instance of blocking in which I would tell them to move into the light. If it's something that just doesn't work overall, of course, that's something that I can incorporate in my feedback to maybe the light crew. So sometimes we don't have an opportunity to do that during the show, but that's a conversation that we would ideally have beforehand. But directors of artistic sign language typically support the interpreters and make sure to instill that confidence in their interpreters as well. I also work with deaf interpreters as well. So I'll work with an interpreter who's deaf while being a deaf DASL myself. And I've also experienced them supporting me when I am working. And oftentimes that means cueing the deaf interpreters because they don't hear any cues. Of course, they've likely memorized their work and all their translations, but the timing specifically is often heard, and so the DASL will let them know that. And if they need to change their demeanor or anything, a DASL would be able to cue them on that as well. So that's the support that can be provided during a show. After a show, of course, there's debriefing to be had. Some shows may have just one interpreted date that they'll have interpreters, but it's still nice to provide that feedback. And it's just something they can keep in their mind for maybe next time they interpret that show. For shows that have multiple interpreted dates, maybe 2, 3, 4, maybe even more, it's a good idea to have that discussion because you can improve upon the work that you just did for the next interpreted date. So we'll talk about what worked and what didn't. We'll talk about what to keep and what not to keep. And these are important conversations to be had after that work. So again, during the show, you can't support the actors, but it's good to be there because afterwards you can provide feedback on what you saw. You can also attend rehearsals and work with the directors for those shows. You can also give them that appropriate lens, a different perspective for the actors. I mean, whether they're deaf or hearing, we're there specifically for the language. And we want to make sure that language is integral to what's happening. So sometimes, in my opinion, I think that shouldn't happen if someone is acting as a deaf person when they're hearing, but when someone is maybe passable as a deaf person, we will work with the language in that aspect as well. But sometimes they don't use any deaf characters. It might just be a hearing actor, but they may use sign language for visual reasons. So maybe there's choreography. Maybe there are some productions that focus on dance, and that interpretive aspect will have sign language incorporated into it. So that is, we don't want them to just use whatever ASL they find. We want to make sure that that sign language is appropriate for that situation. So we can provide that feedback and support for the actors in that aspect. We also work on translations as well. So sometimes there is a script, and maybe it's not the actor's first language. Maybe their first language is ASL, and now they're trying to read a script in English, so they want to make sure that they get it right. And it's important for their character development. So it's important to discuss the script with them. And sometimes some scripts are difficult no matter if you're deaf or hearing, even if English is your first language. I mean, Shakespeare, uh, there's a few other writers. Sometimes people will not understand that no matter if English is your first language or not. So it's a good idea to, and that goes back to dramaturgy. There's also the advocacy that I mentioned earlier. It all ties that back in with that. There are all kinds of productions out there when it comes to theater. And sometimes those theaters may not necessarily advocate for the deaf actors because they don't see it as much more than a language that's already set. But bringing in that perspective, maybe they're working for the first time with a deaf actor. Maybe it's the first time they're working with interpreters. They may just truly not know anything about the deaf community. So we work as advocates and we tell them and communicate what the best practices are for either actors or interpreters. We talk about what's best for the theater experience and for the cast. This is all information that we share with these theaters. Sometimes they will just think about how interpreters cost money, and we all know that access can be very expensive. But sometimes they'll have an interpreter budget and they have that allotted, but they'll scoff at DASL trying to be added on. Now, it's important for a DASL to be part of it, but they don't understand the role of a DASL. And it's all the support that they can provide to actors or interpreters. And it really elevates the experience of the audience. I mean, it just makes a world of difference for the audience. Some people can go and I'm sure they would be able to enjoy shows without it, but to have that deeper, more robust understanding, it's just a world of difference. I mean, it doesn't mean that theater interpreters are inexperienced or they can't do as well without a dazzle, but sometimes with that dazzle, with that extra layer to work with, it just elevates the experience. It makes it that much better, and we're able to provide that for the audience. I mean, I've worked as an interpreter in theater for probably about a good 15 years now before I started dipping into dazzle work. I can't go back to just doing that anymore. I love this line of work. I love being a dazzle, and I loved having a dazzle for when I was interpreting. I mean, it just made my work so much better overall. It was smoother and it really worked for the audience. I mean, I do have trust in myself and in my work, and I understand scripts well generally, but having that support again makes that world of difference. So again, there's advocacy from the dazzle for the actors during rehearsal, and that can look like all sorts of things. Sometimes they may be fine on their own, and I can maybe second what they're coming up with. Maybe they're a new actor just stepping into theater. I can provide that support and make things the best that they can be. Maybe it's the theater's first time using interpreters, and we can advocate in that moment. They may not know what they're doing in that situation, and we can provide that layer of support. I mean, the list can go on and on. It's not there, but dazzles can also be mentors. There are other people that are sometimes interested in becoming dazzles, or maybe interpreters that are new to theater that want to get that experience. They can also work with dazzles. So all of this is encompassed in the role of a dazzle. But dazzles often have the opportunity to educate and make sure to elevate different experiences in other ways as well. So maybe marketing, providing accessibility information. Because some places will just put a date on a flyer and nobody will know where to look. They don't know that it's just on this random file somewhere. Only people who are familiar with the theater experience may know where to look, but people who are new to it may not know. And they've already been frustrated overall because oftentimes they're not provided access to anything in general. So to be able to come and see that show, and it makes a difference to have more than just a line on a flyer. So there are all sorts of services. There's maybe staff there. We're there as support, and we can also talk about what is best for marketing. So an easy example, and it's one that I always encourage, is that they should have a video with ASL information for the deaf community. Because when they see it, they'll get it. It's being communicated to them in their first language. So it's that they think of me as an ASL user. I don't have to read English to find that information. It's being given to me in my source language. There are other languages that are on the flyers, maybe like Spanish, for example, and they're including those communities. So why not have a video with maybe dates and times, or maybe some other common information signed in that video? So maybe they can talk about, oh, this person is playing this role, or this interpreter is interpreting for these characters. That makes a world of difference again. People will show up to these shows. That's an example of PR work and marketing. There's also discussions to be had with technology. It helps if a DASL has experience with technology in the theater world. Some don't. But we will talk about, for example, what's the best color for the lighting to make sure it's as appropriate as possible. And make sure the spotlight is on them, for example. Maybe during the show, they may need to modify lighting. And we'll talk about that with the light crew. And that forces them to change maybe their outlook on interpreting. Or they'll have to think about how spotlights may work. Maybe they need a soft light, whereas they didn't think about all the different kinds of lighting that would be most appropriate. So there's respect for their work, but at the same time, we need to be able to sign. Okay, so these are all roles that are incorporated in the work of a DASL. So it doesn't have to be all of that at the same time, but those are expectations and responsibilities that come with being a DASL. So working with an interpreter team and using ASL is part of the work of a DASL. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and we'll move on to the next one. Thank you so much.
Next slide, ASL interpreter point of view.
Thank you very much, Crom. That was awesome. If you have never worked with Crom, let me tell you, he's phenomenal. He's brilliant. He's amazing as a certified deaf interpreter, as a DASL, as a signer, as a storyteller. Phenomenal. So I would like to just give one quick ad here. If you're having any issues or need some assistance with any type of accessibility, please utilize the chat feature. You can go into chat, hosts and panelists, send anything there. But also I would like to point out bottom of the screen Q&A. So you'll see a square box with the question mark in the middle. It'll say Q&A below. If you click there at any point throughout this whole presentation, if you have any questions that you want answered, please put them in there. We have staff will be monitoring that, and then we will ensure that your questions get answered. So feel free at any point to throw your questions right there. As mentioned, my name is Josh Garrett. I've given my visual description, so I won't bother you with that again. Quickly about me, I am the CEO of Access Consulting. I do a lot of consulting, and some of it is in deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind spaces. So Access, when it comes to captioning and interpreting, that's more my forte and where my career has been focused. Also, more recently, my consulting has been in operations management, people, process, and those types of things. I've been in the interpreting world for about 27 years, my whole adult life. access is super important to me. It's something that I feel it's close to my heart as well. My son has a stepfather who is deaf. He also has deaf family members. So it's something like even within the family that we feel it's very important for us. I also have done theatrical interpreting. So that is another part of my background. I've taught and trained interpreters too. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this view from an interpreter. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Here on the screen, you'll see a large mound of dirt with an excavator digging a hole. And what I can say is when you're working with the DASL, they're really digging deeper into a script, into language, into culture, into nuances. And so it really does take it to a whole deeper level that we can't necessarily get just on our own. Next slide, please. On this slide, you see an iceberg. You'll see a portion of it, the tip of the iceberg is above the water. Down below the water, you'll see a larger part of the iceberg. And then there's certain words on the screen, and I will read those now. Essentially taking into account the tip of the iceberg is what a lot of interpreters can do if they just show up to interpret an event, a performance. It's that tip of the iceberg when it comes to so many aspects. However, working with a DASL, they're going to get language or linguistics variations, and that's what's down below the surface of that iceberg. Additionally, text that's on the bottom here, culture. There'll be cultural nuances that will be given to that interpreter to really translate and get deeper into that. Concepts, conceptual accuracy is something that can come into play. Sometimes interpreters get stuck on this word for word rendition or words as a whole. A DASL can say, let's take those words, trash the words, and here's the concept. Here's what we're really trying to convey. So you get amazing conceptual accuracy. It takes implicit meaning that is often there in English. In English, we use a lot of implicit meaning. However, going into ASL, more of that implicitness needs to either be shown with some nuances or it needs to be made explicit. So meaning is another thing. And just the visual nature of language is something that comes into play in these environments. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll see it looks as if it's a brain. We'll say left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the brain. On the left, it is a silhouette of a male, and it says interpreter. On the right, it's the right silhouette of the brain, but with much more color, and it says interpreter plus DASL with a female silhouette. And this is essentially how I describe working with a DASL. On the left, you have that brain that's not firing on all counts. It's not as colorful. It's not as vibrant. On the right, however, with the DASL, it brings a story to life. It makes something more visual. It takes something that was lacking color and makes it much more colorful and vibrant. It's more fun to see. It's more accessible. It's more equal access. And so it really does take something to the next level. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll see an arrow kind of pointing up and moving upward with the text that says, utilizing a DASL will make the output of the interpreter go from good to great. And it will also make the accessibility of the content for attendees go from good to great. That is a key thing, and Crom has already hit on many of these aspects that will make something go from that good to great to show the differences. There's times when, as interpreters, we're constantly thinking about interpreting the message. If we hear something, we have to be interpreting something. I've worked with DASLs where they say, this is actually a great time to throw the focus. And so a throw the focus simply meaning like if something is happening behind me right here, instead of even signing, I may stop signing, put my hands down, and simply turn and look. And then when I do this, it immediately encourages the whole audience to do the same thing. Why is the interpreter not signing and looking at the stage? It's what we call throw the focus. So a DASL can tell you this is a great time to throw the focus. And it's that we get out of that mindset of, as an interpreter, I have to interpret everything. Sometimes it's more powerful to see what's happening right on the stage. And so you may do a throw the focus, something like that. I will say that as an interpreter, if a show doesn't provide a DASL, I probably am not going to sign up to interpret for the show. It has drastically changed my work. It has taken my work to a whole new level. One example specifically is I was working on a show. We saw the show. We did character analysis, we did script analysis, we did everything that we were supposed to do, and I rocked it. Like, I was so proud of myself. And I knew I was meeting with the DASL next. And so I was so impressed with how I had worked and really stepped out of my words. I get away from the words and more visual and tried to do the best I absolutely could. And it shows, though, I'm not a native signer. I've been signing since sixth grade, but I'm not native. I am nationally certified, but again, that's not my point here. So I go to work with the DASL, and they took what I had put hours into to make it the best I possibly could and just took it to a whole new level that I never could have gotten to on my own. But what I also learned there is it made the show so much more accessible to an audience, but it also was work that I could take when I left and incorporate into my own work. It just made me a better interpreter as a whole in all areas that I was working. So working with the Dazzle really does change things. It brings it to a new level. It takes it to new heights that you certainly couldn't ever do. There's nuances to language that someone has and someone doesn't, and they may have to different degrees. And what I have seen is I've seen a fairly new interpreter and I've seen a seasoned interpreter both get together to work, but their output was both phenomenal. But the underlying aspect or the correlation there was that they had a dazzle who was bringing them both to the highest point that they could possibly get to. And then finally, I will say the other thing is a Spanish comparison. If you can learn Spanish from a native Spanish speaker or from someone who's learned it later in life, where do you want to learn it, right? If you can take a show that's going into Spanish and have a non-native person putting the show into Spanish or a native person putting it into Spanish, who are you going to utilize? It's the same thing with the Dazzle. They'll change the show, they'll change accessibility. With that, I would like to give the floor to Susan Elizabeth. Thank you.
Next slide, theater point of view. Susan Elizabeth signs as Sheila interprets.
Hello, my name is Susan Elizabeth Rangel. This is my name sign, and I want to thank you for inviting me to present here. This is one of my favorite topics. I often present about dazzles, and I want to thank you so much for asking me here. I am Hispanic, and I'm wearing dark clothes. I have dark hair and it's tied back. I'm wearing glasses. I've been working in the profession for 13 years now in different roles as an interpreter, working as a dazzle, and being a consultant. I just recently have been doing more and more work as a dazzle. So I also provide interpreting services through my agency. I love providing opportunities for different interpreters. So I'm going to give you my point of view with this background. Crom has already really explained a lot of the responsibilities of a dazzle. So, but overall, I've worked in theater often, and I know, dazzle, many of you may not understand or have heard of this as a new concept. It's becoming more widespread, dazzle, in the community, and people have more of an understanding that a dazzle, that concept, but it's slowly starting to work its way into the theater community. We want to think about the deaf community and their perspective, and how we can provide professional services, professional interpreters, technology, direction, and follow all of those things. We don't want those missing. We will discuss more about that later. A dazzle is often the better person to take care of things related to the interpreting team and what will take place. Often, if there's some difficulties, you can go to the dazzle and they will be taking care of all the problems. There are a lot of things to manage when you're working on a play or a performance. It's more than, like Josh said, going deeper. It's going deeper into the text and what's happening, making sure the audience has a good experience, knowing where they sit and watch the show. We want it to be a good experience for the deaf audience. And that is the goal for the DASL. I want the deaf audience to have an equal experience. And I say a near equal experience because they will never have an exact equal experience as someone who is hearing. But I think that's what we're trying to get to. That's our goal. You know, we want that experience to be equal, and eventually we'll get there. And, you know, will everybody be signing, you know, in the same way? Maybe not right now, but we will get there eventually. And we also have to consider a lot of different things related to performance. The scheduling of the interpreters, making sure that you have the right people in those seats or involved in the team. We have to consider that. And also, oftentimes there are conflicts for interpreters. Maybe there'll be an actor that gets replaced. So we have to make sure the interpreters know about that. We want them to have a successful interpretation. So we try and remove all obstacles. And the DASL also works as a consultant. The script is very important. And the DASL explains a lot of things to the interpreters. They don't just show up and interpret. They need feedback from the DASL. We work together as a team. So if there's Spanish involved in the play, you know, we want the interpreters to match what's on stage. So we want to put an interpreter there, you know, and if it's a musical, we want an interpreter who has musical skills that can do a better job. We want a specific fit. And we want to be able to expand on concepts. It's not for the DASL alone. We all work together for this production. We're a team. And we're going to give information about, you know, if any characters have been switched out, if there are any changes in the script, we provide that information. There's a lot of work to be done before and during and after the interpretation. And after the interpretation is done, we compare notes, get feedback. And also the DASL has to determine how many interpreters do we need for this performance. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3. It depends on how many characters are within the play itself. And we have to determine the goal. Oh gosh, my time is almost up. Okay. Sometimes we have to decide that the most important thing is to have the audience have a good experience. And sometimes you have to consider quality over quantity. I guess my time has run out. I had a lot more to say, I've thought about this a lot, but my time has been cut short. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to discuss today. And I'll give my time over to Tina now.
Next slide, consumer point of view.
Hello, everyone. I'm also honored to be a Collab Steering Committee member and talking to you all today. I'm a middle-aged female, Filipina female using she, her pronouns. I have gray chin length hair and have clear frame glasses. And I'm talking to you from a hotel room in Seattle, Washington. I am a late deafened adult who uses spoken English and ASL to communicate, and I'm choosing to voice for myself today. My background is as an audiologist, but also as an advocate for accessibility in cultural spaces. So I'm going to literally talk about point of view with you guys all today. So what you see on the screen right now is a GIF with the heading Deaf's Eye Look at Stages and Interpreter. The video credit is to Brittany Castle, a deaf creator of 58 Creativity. It's an animated line drawing that depicts a stage towards the top, and then you see house left, house center, and house right seating. There are also labels for where the interpreter and the deaf patrons are located. A sort of cone of spotlight indicates the line of sight in two different scenarios. The top half shows that when a deaf patron is seated towards the side, they can view the interpreter in action on the stage in direct line of sight. Now, the bottom half shows that when the deaf patron is seated front and center, which is where sometimes people think, oh, that's the best place for them to see. When you do that, that means that the deaf patron has kind of this tennis match neck as they have to look back and forth to view the interpreter, which is on their left, and then they have to look to the right again to see the stage. So as amazing as the interpreters are, it really doesn't matter if we can't see the interpreters and the stage. It's helpful if the deaf patron has the knowledge and the assertiveness to let the box office know that they want to be seated in the area depicted by the top half of this GIF. So same side of the house where the interpreter is located. But it's also important for the box office to know this. At many shows that I've attended through Broadway in Chicago, there's often a staff person walking around and checking with us to make sure that we can see. And I appreciate that so, so much because they're trained to tactfully maybe ask other patrons to move if they're blocking our view. So let's say, though, that there's a situation where they're seated front and center. One way to mitigate this is to maybe ask if there are any seats further back on the house left side, or if they have to sit in the center area, that they're seated back a little further as well, because then that can help minimize that line of sight angle for viewing the interpreter and the stage. Another consideration is that closer is not necessarily better if the deaf patron has to look up at the stage. I got to see King Kong on Broadway a few years back. I got last minute tickets and was seated really front row center. And while it was kind of cool to see everything up close, my neck was a bit stiff after having to look up at the stage the whole performance. I do want to point out that this same line of sight issue applies to deaf, hard of hearing people viewing open captions on an LED reader board, or closed, or what I like to call personal captioning on a handheld device. Okay. So lastly, I do also want to emphasize that lighting matters. Ideally, there's spotlights or overhead lights or lighting from the front on the interpreters. I've also watched interpreters where lighting came more from the side, but that can cause shadows. The last option should be lighting that points directly straight up at the interpreters. This definitely causes shadows on their face, which is so important for interpreting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh to kind of close up.
Thank you very much, Tina. For those of you who do not know Tina, I just wanted you to know that she's also an amazing resource. So if you ever need anything deaf, hard of hearing access related, she is a go-to. Let's see here. What I would like to do now is we have a Q&A, one item. Thank you for posting in there. To answer the question is there a listing of DASL consultants sorted by region and or state? The answer to that is we do currently have 2 folks listed, DASL consultants, just on the current thing. What we're going to do is by the end of this, we're going to add in a few additional consultants that we know of in the state of Illinois. So that will have their name as well as their email address. So you can reach out to them if you are needing them. I will just highlight the 2 that we have here, Crom and Susan Elizabeth, simply because they're here now. Those are 2 that we currently have on the list. Crom and Susan Elizabeth will also be adding more. Crom.
Crom signs while Ahmed interprets.
I also did want to add to that, if you don't mind. I wanted to clarify that DASLs are in high demand in the theater world. So there are DASLs by state out there, but DASLs will often travel to other states. I mean, they'll go, they won't just work here in Illinois, for example. I've been to Connecticut, I've been to Michigan, I've been to many different states for my line of work. So there are going to be names state by state, but don't think that you're limited specifically to the state that you're in. They can be hired from other locations and is in fact common practice to do so.
Excellent. If you do have any further questions before the end here, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. Anything else from Crom before I proceed?
Yes, I just wanted to reinforce what Susan Elizabeth was mentioning, that DASLs do have the potential to accommodate all of these different needs, and that is part of their role. But it's also the role of the DASL to work with the actors and everything as well. So there's a potential for a lot of responsibility. It all just comes with the job. And if there are any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer. But for now, I'll go ahead and turn my camera off.
DASL Resources QR Coded Center, link in video description below.
Excellent. This is Josh again. Thank you so much. So we will be following up with all the participants via email. You'll see on the screen now, DASL resources list. It is the current list. Just so you know, you can you can get that code now if you'd like to have it. But also, we will email this out, and we will add some additional updates to that at the end of this presentation.
Next slide, survey QR code at left, donation QR code at right. Links in video description below.
Also, today's slideshow presentation will be emailed out, and we'll have a link for a feedback survey. Your feedback obviously helps make things better for future participants and lets us know our areas of improvement. We would appreciate if you would complete that for us. And you're also welcome to do it right now if you would like while we're wrapping up here. We do have another program scheduled, and that will take place on December 12th. And we're bringing something back via popular demand. It's called Loud and Proud, Maximizing Your Accessibility Info for Guests. So that will be in partnership with Great Lakes ADA Center and the wonderful Arts and Rec webinar series. So there is a QR code, which you will see here for that. Also, will be going out via email as a reminder, also on our website if you would like to check that out. We are going to be bringing today's program to a close here momentarily. We do still have a few moments. If any of our panelists would like to add a few final comments, or if anyone in the audience has any questions for us.
Crom signs while Ahmed interprets.
I just want to make sure I'm not stealing the spotlight. Okay. So I also did want to thank everybody for coming as well. We always appreciate people who are open to learning more about this. I mean, we're not just serving the audience better, and it's something that you're thinking about coming to this. So thank you so much.
I want to thank all of the folks who joined and here, all of your participants, also our presenters, our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate you. Shout out to the Collab for all the work that they do, and also Susan Elizabeth. Go ahead.
Susan Elizabeth signs as Sheila interprets.
Yes. There were there was so much to talk about, but anyone, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Is my email posted somewhere? Oh, okay, you're going to take care of that. All right.
Yes. So
And
on the resources, we'll make sure that that email is included as well as Crom's. So you'll have access to both of the DASLs that we had presenting today. All right. So I want to thank you again for being here. Our shout out to the collab team, for the board, for everyone doing the great work that they're doing. Our session will be concluded. We do want to say if you would like to make a donation, we would certainly appreciate that. I just want you to know, collab members, we do not accept payment for what we're doing here. This is a volunteer opportunity, something that we love doing, but the funding does go to the collab and expanding networks and providing additional access. So that's not something going to us, but something going to further the development of access for everyone in these cultural spaces. So if you would like to make a donation, feel free. And we thank you for being here. We hope to see you again in the future. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks for sharing your lunch with us.
Credits appear. Director of Artistic Sign Language. How to Dazzle Your Audience. Presented by Cultural Access Collaborative. For workshop resources and more information, visit culturalaccesscollab.org. Presenting speakers: Josh Garrett, Cultural Access Collab; Crom Saunders, DASL; Susan Elizabeth Rangel, DASL; Tina Childress, Audiologist. Workshop Accessibility, Efficiency Reporting, Real-Time Captioning: Sheila Kettering, Jessica Valle, Ahmed Karamis, ASL Interpretation. Video Editing, Captioning, and Audio Description by BridgetMelton.com.